On June 4th, 1976, the Sex Pistols played a concert that reached mythological status. Performing in front of only 40 people in Manchester, a considerable proportion of the audience went on to start their own bands afterward. It created a music butterfly effect like never seen before, and will probably never happen again. Our story starts in 1976 when students Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto come across an article in the British music magazine NME. The headline read, "Don't look over your shoulder, the Sex Pistols are coming." This was before the internet, and the Sex Pistols had not yet released any records. So to hear their music, they rented a car and drove 200 miles down to London to see them play live. They saw them not once but twice and got in touch with the band's manager to persuade them to play in their local city of Manchester. But these two students had ulterior motives. They were starting their own band, and if they organized a Sex Pistols concert, they could put themselves in as the supporting act. The Sex Pistols agreed to play at the Lesser Free Trade Hall, a 400-seater venue along Peter Street in Manchester, on June 4th, 1976. According to Shelley, "We booked the hall, we printed tickets, we tried to advertise it as best we could, and then on the 4th of June, Sex Pistols came up to play to an unsuspecting audience." Punk rock was only in its infancy in the US and really not that much heard of in the UK. So the spectacle of a punk rock gig was something almost completely alien to its audience members. Shelley and Devoto were not ready yet with their band to fill in as the supporting act, so another group played instead. But the gig itself was something that answered any of the doubts they may have had about becoming musicians. As the Sex Pistols emerged onto the stage, their look, sound, and overall demeanor was, at times, quite terrifying. One witness spoke out about their lead singer, Johnny Rotten, and said, "He was one of the most frightening people I've ever seen at the time. This lad with a 1,000-yard stare just stood there." As they played, there were mixed reviews. One audience member said, "They were excellent. They made all of the hairs stand on the back of your head." Another audience member said, "Well, they were just dreadful, totally unrehearsed. I think they had just gone out of the way to get noticed and be as bad as they possibly could be." But as strange as this might sound, this mixture of reactions had the same end result. On the one hand, audience members were inspired to be like the Sex Pistols. On the other side of the spectrum, people thought that the Sex Pistols were terrible and figured that they could do better. Had this audience seen the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, they might have been in awe of their talents. But the Sex Pistols gave them the impression that making music was something everybody could and should do. David Nolan, who's written extensively about this gig, said, "Many people in the audience that night didn't look at the Pistols and so much think, 'I want to do that.' But instead, they looked at the young Londoners and thought, 'Come on, I could do way better than that.'" The actual show, good or bad, was not what gave this concert its legendary status. It was what happened afterward. Closing the show, one audience member said, "The audience sat there with their mouths open. After they finished, they weren't quite sure whether they were good or what, but the attack and the aggression of it was something to behold." Word of mouth got around the band, and this sparked what became the punk music scene in the UK. A few weeks later, the Sex Pistols played in the city of Sheffield and were supported by The Clash and The Damned, two other groups that would spearhead punk rock music. On the night of that first gig in Manchester, the organizers, Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto, bumped into a guy named Steve Diggle, who would become the guitarist for their newly formed band, the Buzzcocks. Reflecting on that gig, Diggle said, "That was the day the punk rock atom was split. No doubt about it. It was amazing to see. That's where it exploded from. It changed Manchester, and it changed the world." 6 months after this gig, the Buzzcocks released their first EP, Spiral Scratch. The fact that this record performed so well on an independent label has made many consider that this moment was the birth of indie rock and independent music, and the Buzzcocks were just one of many groups that came out of this famous Sex Pistols gig. Also in the audience that night was Eddie Garrity, who went on to start his own punk band, Ed Banger and the Nosebleeds. This band would become popular around Manchester, but he was one of the least successful musicians in the audience that night. By 1978, the Buzzcocks released their debut album, Another Music in a Different Kitchen. But that same year, the butterfly effect of that gig had gotten a bit wider. Tony Wilson, who was a TV broadcaster at the time, was in the crowd that night and had been so inspired by the Pistols that he decided to start his own music label in Manchester called Factory Records. A year later, a total of 6 audience members from the Pistols gig were in a band releasing music. In the crowd that night were Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner, both of whom decided to start their own group afterward called Joy Division. Recalling the gig, Peter Hook said, Literally the next day, I went to Mazel's in Manchester and bought a bass guitar for 35 quid. 1979 saw Joy Division release Unknown Pleasures, an album considered one of the most influential and critically acclaimed albums in rock music. And coincidentally, they were signed by Tony Wilson's Factory Records. They would release 2 albums as Joy Division, and then after the tragic suicide of their singer Ian Curtis, go on to form New Order and achieve similar acclaim. But also in the audience that night was a man named Mark E. Smith. In 1979, his band, The Fall, released its debut album, Live from the Witch Trials. The Fall would not have the same success as Joy Division, but would have a cult following and become one of the longest-running bands in British history. At the time of the gig, Smith was working down at Manchester Docks and has since joked, "I would have a marvelous job in shipping if it weren't for the Sex Pistols. I'd probably have my own shipping company, worldwide." Many times I've cursed the Sex Pistols. Perhaps the most unlikely disciple of the Sex Pistols was Mick Hucknall, who was also reportedly in attendance at the concert. He and fellow audience member Ian Moss formed the brand The Frantic Elevators and released their first single in 1979 called Voice in the Dark. In his subsequent group, Simply Red, he would release a soul song named Holding Back the Years in 1985, which would reach #1 in the US. Hucknall has since said that punk was something he gravitated towards as an outsider. He was inspired by the Sex Pistols, but also the work of fellow audience members during that gig. In an interview in 2003, he said, "You're 16, you've got spots, and you can't get a girlfriend. Then you hear Boredom by the Buzzcocks and you think, that's me. For my generation, it was Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols, the first EP by The Fall, and Spiral Scratch by the Buzzcocks. But I was listening to the Beatles as well, which you weren't allowed to if you were a punk. So I never quite fitted in." The domino effect of this gig would spiral further on into the 80s. By 1982, Tony Wilson had moved on from Factory Records and set up the Hacienda nightclub, a venue that would go on to have legendary status in Manchester and spiral on its dance music scene in the 90s. For another audience member at that Sex Pistols gig, his legacy would not become apparent until '84. Stephen Patrick Morrissey was in the crowd and later shortened his name to Morrissey. In the late 1970s, he actually replaced his fellow audience member Eddie Garrity as the lead singer of the Nosebleeds. But by the mid-'80s, he was now lead singer of the band The Smiths, one of the most successful and influential British rock groups of all time. During that gig, he was only 17 years old, and actually wrote a review. He said, "The Sex Pistols are very New York, and it's nice to see that the British have produced a band capable of producing atmosphere created by the New York Dolls and their many imitators, even though it may be too late. I'd love to see the Pistols make it. Maybe they'll be able to afford some clothes which don't look as though they've been slept in." And it was not just musicians that were inspired by this gig from the Sex Pistols. Kevin Cummins was also in attendance and would go on to become a famous music photographer, particularly within the British music scene. Coincidentally, he would become a photographer for the Sex Pistols, but also for his fellow concert attendees from Joy Division, the Smiths, and The Fall. 18 months after the gig, Cummins was following the Sex Pistols on tour as a magazine photographer, to the extent that he abandoned his family on Christmas Day to attend a Pistols gig. He said in an interview, "Britain was a very different place in 1977, and the Sex Pistols were the Antichrist. Your parents hated them, and the press played up to that. The press always like a pantomime villain. So of course when I told them I was going out on Christmas Day, they were outraged, especially when I told them what I was doing. My girlfriend at the time was locked in her house. Her parents wouldn't let her go, even though she had a ticket for it." And lastly, the journalist Paul Morley was also in the audience. He was just 19 years old at the time, but would go on to become a formidable journalist within British music and wrote extensively for the music magazine NME. He's written not one, but 2 books about Joy Division, and another one on Tony Wilson. Commenting on this gig, he said, "I became the writer I wanted to be, writing from a city that reacted the quickest and smartest to the lurid poetics of the Sex Pistols." The concert received an almost mythical status in British culture. Johnny Rotten remembers very little about the gig. He's since said, "They say everyone who was at those gigs went out and formed a band, but that wasn't our plan, or our fault." As time went on, the Chinese whispers of what happened that night and who was there became muddy. There was even conflicting information of what happened and who was there. In 2002, a movie about the Manchester music scene came out called 24-Hour Party People. Tony Wilson, played by the actor Steve Coogan, says in the movie, "The smaller the attendance, the bigger the history. There were 12 people at the Last Supper. It became such a you had to be there moment that some people even lied about going. The only footage of the gig was taken on an 8mm camera by a music fan on the night, who managed to sell it for about $19,000 in 2021. As far as I can tell, it doesn't have any extensive shots of the audience to prove who was there. The journalist, David Nolan, who I mentioned earlier, decided to dig deeply into what actually happened on that fateful night and released a book titled, I Swear I Was There. Hundreds of people claimed they had attended, but this conflicted with the evidence that he found. Records held in the Manchester City Council archives revealed that 14 euros was the income generated from the gig. Tickets were 50 pence, which meant that only 28 tickets were sold. Given that not everyone there needed to buy a ticket, he reckons there were roughly 40 people there at most. But this is despite the fact that hundreds of people claimed to have attended. A similar phenomenon happened after the famous Woodstock Festival in 1969. Millions of people say that they were there, whereas the actual figure in attendance was about 500,000. Nolan levels a lot of the blame at the movie 24 Hour Party People and said, "The first scene is a variety of people sat in the lesser free trade hall watching the Sex Pistols. It's become this big myth, and you still open books now and the myth is still perpetuated. I know it's desperately unfashionable, but I thought, let's just have the truth for once, rather than the myth." The biggest bombshell for Nolan was that Tony Wilson, who regularly prided himself about having been there, was probably somewhere else that night. Nolan explained, there were 40-odd people in the audience that night, and Tony was incredibly famous. For people not to notice he was there, I'm not sure. Pete Shelley from Buzzcocks, who took the money on the door, doesn't remember Tony being there. Howard Devoto, who organized the gig, doesn't remember Tony being there. When this accusation was made, Tony Wilson was apparently incredibly angry. Wilson had built up a lot of his reputation off the back of the fact that he was at this gig, and Nolan was basically calling him a liar. At one stage, Wilson said to him, "You know what you said about me not being at the Sex Pistols gig? That was effing snide." Nolan admitted, but who knows, in another 5 years I could have found a photograph of Tony Wilson stood next to the Sex Pistols at the gig, and I'll have to make an apology. But the story was more complicated than people simply lying about it. There was a second Sex Pistols gig a few weeks later where many more people attended, but this wasn't the legendary one that kickstarted the punk movement. Nolan said, "When we did the original documentary program, we devised a test and questionnaire for people to fill in. What we found out was that some people were at the second gig, but thought they were at the first. It was also disputed that Mick Hucknall and Mark E. Smith were not actually at the gig too, and were actually at the second show instead." And then, of course, Nolan found out just how unreliable the human memory is. Some were at neither, but 99% of the time people were genuinely convinced they had been there. Both the documentary and book are full of contradictory stories from people. That's the notion of memory. People misremember things. Plus, it's a flippin' long time ago. Despite the mountains of stories about the concert, little had been heard from the band who supported the Sex Pistols on that night. Nolan was flabbergasted when he tracked them down and realized that they pretty much didn't care that they were at this gig. It's one of the most important gigs ever. It's a bit like playing at Live Aid and never mentioning it to your wife. I think that's fantastic. I was there, but I don't need to go on about it. Despite the fact that Nolan wanted to uncover some of the myths behind it, he still maintains that it's one of the most important concerts ever. How many were at Woodstock? 500,000? Something like that? As opposed to 40-odd, slightly weird-smelling, long-haired Manchester Mancunians in this little room. But what those Mancunians did was astonishing. They sent club culture around the world. They sent the independent record scene around the world. They took a style of music around the world. You know, that's an amazing thing to come out of one little room on Peter Street. Fantastic. Make sure to subscribe for more.